Welcome to the first episode of Tell Me More, which is your chance to ask your burning news questions to the reporters that actually wrote that news in the first place. Today, we're joined by political live blogging extraordinaire Krishani Dhanji from the Guardian Australia's Canberra bureau. How are you going?
Hello, Matilda. I am great. How are you?
Good, going very well. And we've brought you here to chat about the first couple of days of the campaign, what we've seen the politicians doing, what that means about their values, who, if anyone, has sort of come out on top at this very start. Before we dive in, I just want to remind everyone you can leave questions as we go in the comments wherever you're watching. Or we also posted to Instagram earlier asking for your questions. If you are watching on Instagram, you'll have to use that story prompt to ask the questions. Otherwise, you can comment away on TikTok or YouTube or wherever else you're watching. Now that the sort of housekeeping is done, Kashani, can you just tell us a bit about what's happened so far? We're what, 4 or 5 days in?
Yeah, honestly, it feels like we're several weeks in, and it's just been a total whirlwind because, as you might remember, I can't even keep a straight face anymore. We went straight from the budget last week, last Tuesday, straight into campaign mode on Friday, and now the leaders, both sides, all sides, have been traveling around the country trying to vie for your vote. So it's been quite the whirlwind. So far, there's been a lot of traveling, a lot of plane rides. The Prime Minister has been, I think, to every single state and territory so far, except for the Northern Territory on the first 5 days of the campaign.
Yeah,
And
wow.
the opposition leader has hit a fair few states, big focus on New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland as well. So, yeah, I mean, you can really start. We're kind of getting to the point where you can see the messages really starting to shape up a lot. So there's been a massive focus in the last couple of days, particularly on like the APS cuts, so cuts to the public service.
Mm,
And you can see as well that Peter Dutton, for example, has been really trying to shape up this message between weak leadership and strong leadership. And that's something that is really taking shape and will kind of be more consequential tomorrow, we will find, when the Trump administration announces their next kind of round of tariffs. And so, I mean, even more broadly than that, like Trump has had such a big, tying the two issues
mm.
together, such a big influence so far on the election. A lot of commentators saying that, or a lot of people in general saying that those public service cuts are a direct kind of almost a copy and paste from what Doge is doing in the US. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
there's like a really kind of big issue that we've been talking about so far there.
So that's interesting. So Labor's sort of tagline is, we add and plan for the future, and the Liberals cut. And then the Liberals' tagline is sort of, we're strong, Labor's weak,
There
essentially. Yeah.
100%. And like you can see it a lot in the ads. Like Labor just put out an ad this morning. We saw it in Question Times last week. We've seen it a lot in the press conferences, not just from Albanese, but all the interviews that they're doing. It's like their sort of central message in relation to this issue is Peter Dutton will cut everything but your taxes. So that's kind of going back to that budget announcement from last week as well, when they announced a tax cut which would come into effect mid next year, which would cut a percentage from next year and another percentage after that off that bracket between 18,200 and 45,000. And then, yeah, sort of comparing that to all the other cuts that they're kind of claiming that will be made to health, education. We saw Peter Dutton not really rule out making cuts to the ABC today. So that's turning into an interesting kind of debate.
It's interesting. I mean, we've been hearing for ages, like, oh, just wait until the campaign starts, then we'll start getting promise after promise after promise after promise. What
Yeah.
promises have we got so far? It feels like we knew a lot going in, but what's been new?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's for sure. We kind of knew, I mean, the opposition knew that as soon as the budget would be over, a campaign would be happening very, very quickly. So we saw a big sort of chunk of the campaign promises announced or foreshadowed in that budget reply last week. So one of the big ones of that is the changes to gas. So increasing the number of gas plants that there would be in Australia, as well as creating a gas reservation policy on the East Coast, which would mean that a certain amount of gas that is produced would have to be reserved for domestic use rather than being sold on the international market. So that was one of the big ones that they did announce last week. In terms of this week, one of the ones that was announced over the last couple of days was changes to rules to help buyers, and particularly first-home buyers, enter the housing market.
And that's
So
from the coalition as well.
that's from the coalition, sorry, I should specify. So what that would do is change something called the serviceability buffer. So really roughly, when you're going to get a loan from the bank will have to consider whether you can pay that loan or make those repayments if the interest rate was higher than it currently is, and currently that setting is 3%. So the Liberals are saying, well, that prices people out because they may not be able to afford that, but interest rates are not necessarily going to jump up that much like they have since COVID, but from this point they're probably not going to go up another 3%. So maybe APRA, the body in charge, should consider how they might be able to make that a more flexible scheme to help people get into the housing market. So that's kind of one thing that they've announced this week. Dutton's also flitted back and forth around some referendum ideas, and there's been a lot of back and forth and push and pull on what those actually mean. From the Labor side, we've seen they announced they announced that they want to look at price gouging. So exactly where price gouging might be happening within supermarkets, and then seeing how the ACCC and the Treasury Department might be able to work together to crack down on that. They also today, and this was their big announcement today, put in another submission to the Fair Work Commission to increase minimum wages to above the rate of inflation. So that's something that the government can do every year. And the coalition didn't really quite match that. They said they want people to see wage rises, but they wouldn't specify whether that should be above the rate of inflation or what they would do if, for example, they were in government and they were to make a submission. So those are a couple of things that we've seen so far.
For sure. We've got a question from one of our viewers on Instagram from SKA Koala. Is any of the parties proposing changes to HECS debt indexation, so university help loan indexation?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. And education is something that Labor's got sort of on its platform. So they, last year, I think it was, had changed the rules. So previously, HECS debt was indexed to the CPI, to inflation, and that obviously skyrocketed off the back of the COVID pandemic, which meant that people were paying like 7%, people including me, were paying 7% indexation on their HECS loans, which is a lot. So
that's your for however much inflation goes up that year, your HECS debt is also increased by that amount.
The same amount, yeah. And so it's good when inflation is really low, like it's been for the past few years, but then as soon as that jumps, it's really high. And obviously at the same time, wages aren't increasing, and so you're sort of at a net loss there. So what Labor did was change that to make it that the indexation would be either on inflation or on the wage price index, whichever one was lower. So that's a change that they made. They're also promising, if they win, to cut HECS debts by 20%. That's obviously not the question. I don't believe that the Liberal Party has made announcements on changing the rate of indexation. The Greens want HECS debts to be scrapped altogether. So I think they said that would cost around $80 billion or something like that. So that's my best answer for you there.
For sure. And I was wondering, I mean, when we're seeing where each party is going, Dutton, you mentioned spending a lot of time in New South Wales, elbow all over the place. What does that sort of tell us about where their priorities are? And, is there certain areas that both parties are going to really want to be targeting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So on that last point today, both leaders were in Victoria. So Melbourne is going to be super crucial to this election. So in 2022, there was a pretty big exodus of support out of Victoria for the Liberal government. part of that was unpopularity with Scott Morrison, and big popularity with Dan Andrews at the time. And so we saw these sort of suburban seats go to the Labor Party. And then in subsequent by-elections, we saw Aston, for example, which is in sort of outer suburban Victoria, that was lost in a by-election from the Liberal Party to the Labor Party. And that was like the first time in around 100 years that a sitting government had actually won a by-election from the opposition. Normally it kind of swings the other way because people are feeling a bit frustrated by what's going on in politics. So the Liberal Party really, really needs to claw back seats, particularly those seats, aspirational areas that they've had for a really long time. And Labor desperately needs to sandbag those seats and make sure that they don't lose them. I think people have told me that there's definitely a lot of concern that there's a few seats that will be lost, but they're definitely trying to minimise the damage and try and sort of bolster that support. And just the sort of other element of that is that Jacinta Allen, the current Premier, isn't nearly as popular as some of the other premiers across the state. And so she doesn't exactly kind of help bolster that support for the federal government. One of the other really interesting areas is around the Hunter region. So there's a few seats there that are currently Labor held, two of them that were won by Labor at the last election. Sorry, you go.
No. Tell, just maybe situate us of where the Hunter region is for those who don't know.
Sorry, of course, I'm Sydney-based originally, but the Hunter is basically like sort of 2.5, 3 hours drive north of Sydney. It's a real kind of mining region. It's stretches from the coast to like sort of 2-3 hours inland. And so you've got seats like the Hunter, which is mining country, and then you've got seats like Dobell, and you've got Patterson. Patterson, particularly one that the coalition are trying to win off Labor. And so there's a couple of those seats that are like bellwether seats as well, which basically means that generally when there's a change in government, the seat will change to the party that wins. And so those are always seats to watch too. So big kind of focus there. Labor's particularly keen on WA as well, and it was one of the first stops that the Prime Minister made, standing right next to Roger Cook, the Premier over there, who also just got a massive win back on March 8th. So yeah, that's kind of where a lot of the focus is at the moment.
Yeah, and this is interesting. It sort of leads into another question that someone has submitted, which is, we talk a lot about, obviously, fights in inner suburban seats. Are there any, and fights, I guess, against Labor and the Liberals out there, but they ask, will we see any progressive challenges in rural National Party held seats?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first thing to remember is that one of the first kind of community independence, a part of that movement that we've seen was Cathy McGowan, who was in Indi, which was a Liberal-held seat, but more of a regional area. There is one seat to watch for sure, which is Cowper. So that's held currently by Nationals MP Pat Conahan, and a candidate named Kaz Heiss, I think that's how you say her last name, is challenging him. She challenged him at the last election and came somewhat within striking distance. There were only a couple of points margin by the end of the vote. And so the independent campaign is feeling, I think, somewhat not confident, but sort of hopeful that they might be able to make a little bit more progress on that seat. So that's definitely one where there is a real regional seat that we're seeing a change in.
Whereabouts in the country is that one?
That's in Victoria.
Yeah, very nice. So what you mentioned it before, and people have been very curious. The US, we've got this slightly ominous sounding Liberation Day coming up. I think in a matter of hours it will almost click over. What is Liberation Day and how might it affect the campaign?
Yeah, it's a great question, and will definitely have an impact over here on the sort of language that we see, the reaction that we have from both sides. Liberation Day is essentially, as I understand it, the kind of next round of tariffs and rules that will be put in place under the Trump administration. So they're looking now at things like the agriculture sector, media, social media, so all those sorts of areas. Agriculture is definitely a big one that has drawn a lot of attention to Australia. and the other huge one is pharmaceuticals. So the pharmaceutical companies have, as you know, you might have read or seen, have complained to the Trump administration saying that our PBS, which recently the government announced would be lowered to $25 a script and the coalition matched, is creating an unlevel playing field for outside players, and also, you know, sort of reflecting on the amount of time that it takes for medicines to be approved from outside into Australia. So
That's an interesting comment. It's creating an uneven playing field. It's like that's kind of the point, right? Is that the government sort of has bulk buys and then because of that can buy. So basically, the Australian government sort of buys in bulk all our medication. That means that they can get a much cheaper rate. They have more bargaining power. That's the sort of general gist of the PBS.
I should know this. I don't know all the sort of mechanisms behind it. I just know that medicine is cheap and I get cheap medicine. Is my like extremely kind of surface level knowledge of how the PBS works. Medicine, cheap. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of anger across the Pacific Ocean. I had to remember which ocean it was. Pacific Ocean, as to, you know, the kind of companies that are frustrated by how that system does work. So the kind of impact that there are a couple of schools of thought here, I think, as to what impact this will have and how it reflects on both leaders. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, like there's been this kind of real angling to compare Peter Dutton with Donald Trump. And
that's been like a big strategy from Albo, hasn't it? To sort of
totally. So they're kind of
Timu Trump, I feel like, was said in Parliament.
Albo was asked about that. Are you calling Dutton Timu Trump? He said no. But yes, that is what we heard in Parliament Question Time last week from Greens MP Stephen Bates. So yeah, there's like they're really trying to kind of make that comparison, sort of hinging on the hope that Australians will be repelled in a way by that, and then sort of see that as we don't want the Americanization of our politics in Australia. But the other kind of point that I also mentioned is that Dutton has been trying to create this weak, strong comparison of leadership, and so Australia could get hit. And even Penny Wong, the foreign minister today, was talking about how we have to be quite, you know, quote unquote realistic about the outcomes that we will see here, and I believe that they're being announced at about 7 a.m. our time tomorrow morning, which is when the blog starts. But yeah, we have to be realistic about what this all kind of means, or what will happen. Dutton has been saying that he would take a far more kind of aggressive approach at the Trump administration, and, you know, would fight more against the Trump administration. I think somewhat similar to what we've kind of seen from Canada and Mark Carney, the Prime Minister over there, who I think his approach has been quite popular in Canada, but our situation is very different in Australia. So,
well, yes, we have significantly less bargaining power, don't we?
100%, and we don't share a border either. So. Yeah.
And like Australia standing up to the US, there is a certain element of like the US being like, okay.
Yeah, right? and also like Albo's kind of made the point too that America accounts for about 5% of our exports. So the big point that Labor's been trying to make is that, well, we'll just go elsewhere. Like, what's the kind of, you know, us? We've been diversifying since trying to hit us with those massive trade tariffs a couple of years ago. We'll just keep going along on our merry way and finding markets elsewhere. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out and how they really try and shape those narratives to attack the other side based on what happens tomorrow.
For sure. And we've got, I mean, I'll let you be free soon enough, but we've had a couple of people sort of ask questions along the line of how can they go about talking to their family members, and especially, for example, family members who have the common sentiment of, oh, the election doesn't really matter either. Both sides are the same. And, you know, I guess to a certain degree, we have seen the Liberals agreeing to, or the Liberal coalition agreeing to match a lot of Labor's policies. There are a lot of policies that are the same going ahead. But for people who are wanting to be able to have that conversation with their families, what are the main differences between the Labor and the coalition platforms at this point?
Yeah, no, and look, I totally get that it is really hard sometimes to see the differences when you're seeing things like the coalition matching all of the health promises that are being made, for example, that Labor is saying, you know, like the $8.5 billion to increase bulk billing and money for women's health. But there are a few really key differences that we can see, and that are the most obvious ones if you want to have a quick chat and not like a 2 hour long lengthy, discussion with your family at the Christmas table, or whatever. Christmas is ages away, but like, so one of the main ones I'd point out first is energy. Huge difference, and in something that both sides really try and point out the differences in each other as well. So on the Labor side, we have a big renewable energy plan. So they've got 2030 targets, like 82% renewables in the energy grid by 2030. They're waiting to put out their 2035 targets, so we don't have that as yet. But like, that's a really big focus for them, and something that they've been trying really hard to roll out, talking about things like more solar panels on roofs, community batteries, those sorts of things. More focus on electric vehicles as well, trying to introduce like vehicle emission standards. So that's kind of where they really lie. That's where their priority is, on the energy space. And as well, just on that, like, that's renewables, which they say would be backed in by gas. And hydro, snowy hydro as well. On the Liberal side, really big focus on gas, as we've heard over the last couple of days. And then obviously they have their nuclear energy plan, which is about sort of more than a decade, 15 years away. So that's probably like the easiest comparison on emissions and how they're going to get there to net zero by 2050. The other one is tax cuts, for example. So this is another one that Labor and Liberal are trying to, and I kind of mentioned it earlier as well, that, Labor's got this message that the only thing that the Liberals won't cut, or the coalition won't cut, is your taxes. So they obviously announced their tax cuts, their modest tax cuts, top up they called them, last week. The Liberals have said that they would repeal that if they came into government, and instead they've put forward a 25-cent, and a cut to the petrol excise, which would kind of lower what you pay at the Bowser. So that's probably another kind of easy, big one to compare as well.
That's interesting as well, that I guess that sort of goes into even the sort of energy policies on both sides.
Totally.
Labor focusing on EV, so the Liberals are doubling down on, no, we'll make petrol cheaper. That sort of aspect. Look, I will let you go because you are working so hard for so many hours of the day. Go have just a little curl up on the floor of the Canberra office. Before we go, I should remind everyone that the cutoff to enrol to vote or change your address, which is important if you've moved since the last election, you must change your address. That cutoff is 8 p.m. This Friday. The 7th of April. No, yes, the 7th of April. So make sure you get that in. Otherwise, you will not be able to vote, and you will get a $20 fine.
Well, the other point I was going to make, Matilda, with your last question, is just that the kind of premise that your vote doesn't matter, which I think you briefly mentioned, is so wrong. Everyone's vote really matters, and you should definitely enroll, and you should definitely vote, and it makes such a difference. And you'll see in this election, like, the polling says everything is totally down to the wire. We could end up in a minority government. So your vote matters so much.
Yeah, it really is a situation where there will be a lot of electorates that, like, genuinely could come down to the hundreds, if not dozens of votes. Like, it will, like, every vote matters is extraordinarily true for this election.
Completely. And it's going to be very exciting to watch.
Yes, exciting. Lots of tension in the air. Thank you so much. This has been so brilliant. I kind of forgot we were live streaming. I thought we were just having a good old gab about politics. So I'm so glad that you've been here.
Thank you so much.